Welcome to The Explainer. Let's jump right into it today, because we're looking at a comprehensive, globally coordinated roadmap designed to tackle one of the most widespread and, frankly, totally preventable threats to children's health in the world. We're going to unpack the UN-backed Partnership for a Lead-Free Future, or the PLF framework. And honestly, what's truly astonishing about this crisis is how rarely we hear about it on the front pages, despite the sheer overwhelming scale of the danger.
So, let's talk about that scale. Look at this number, 1 billion. That represents the 1 billion children worldwide who are currently exposed to lead. It's not a typo, no exaggeration. 1 billion kids are right now exposed to a dangerous neurotoxin. To put that into perspective, we're talking about roughly 1 in 3 children globally. And the damage? It's profound. Exposure doesn't just pass through a child's system, it actually impairs early brain development, drastically reduces lifelong learning potential, and affects their health across their entire lifespan, triggering everything from behavioral issues in childhood all the way to severe cardiovascular disease later in adulthood.
The grim reality of this silent epidemic is that exposure is happening in highly visceral, everyday environments. We aren't just talking about peeling paint in old houses anymore. We're talking about informal, totally unregulated used lead-acid battery recycling happening right in the middle of vulnerable neighborhoods. We're talking about toxic lead compounds secretly hiding in adulterated spices, in cosmetics, and in culturally specific consumer goods. It's a poison that is just woven directly into the daily lives of families.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the silent epidemic, then move to Vision 2040, break down the 9 indicators used to track progress, and finally look at activating partnerships.
Let's dive right into Section 1, the silent epidemic, and why this is such a preventable crisis. Historically, efforts to address this crisis have been incredibly fragmented, right? And they've been hampered by massive data gaps across different regions. What makes it so difficult to fight now is that these pathways are hiding in plain sight. We aren't dealing with a single point of failure here. We're dealing with a systemic issue across consumer goods, food systems, contaminated water, and unregulated industrial activities. And the cruel reality is that these exposure pathways disproportionately impact low and middle-income countries. Because the sources are so varied, from a battery being recycled in a backyard to a spice sold in a local market, the result is irreversible brain damage and lifelong economic consequences for entire generations who simply don't have the regulatory shield that other countries might take for granted.
Moving on to Section 2, Vision 2040 and the PLF framework.
To fix a fragmented system, we need the entire global community pulling in the exact same direction. Which brings us to our endgame, a massive 95% reduction in childhood lead poisoning by the year 2040. It's a really bold line in the sand. It tells the global community that we already have the tools, we already have the knowledge, and near universal protection from lead isn't just a pipe dream. It is technically achievable if we align our resources.
But how do we actually measure a 95% reduction? Well, we look at the World Health Organization's benchmark, tracking the proportion of children under 5 with blood lead levels above 5 micrograms per deciliter. Now, it is absolutely vital to remember that no amount of lead is safe. Literally zero. Even trace amounts cause cognitive harm. But reducing children's blood lead levels globally below this specific 5 microgram threshold serves as our primary, measurable milestone to ensure our public health actions are actually working on a massive scale. Let's look at Section 3, tracking progress using the 9 indicators.
Let's see how this builds a journey from zero data all the way to massive health outcomes. The framework uses 9 specific indicators, starting with 6 at the country level. Think of this as the story of a country building its foundational systems entirely from scratch. Look at the logical flow here. Indicator 1 is gathering representative blood lead level data. Why? Because you simply can't regulate what you haven't measured. Once you actually have the data, then you identify the high-priority sources, you build a multi-sectoral action plan, you set up routine surveillance, and finally, you pass new laws and ruthlessly enforce them. It's a step-by-step ladder moving a nation from blind awareness to strict legal enforcement. And when you scale these expectations globally, the timeline gets highly aggressive. In 2027, the goal is for just 20 countries to have representative blood lead level data and comprehensive action plans in place. But look at that jump to 2035. We need 110 countries with active data and 100 with comprehensive action plans. That translates a localized, piecemeal effort into a massive, tightly woven global network of compliant, data-rich countries over a single decade. It demands an unprecedented level of international coordination.
But here's the reality check. Developing nations can't just build these extensive surveillance and enforcement systems in a vacuum. The resources required to test blood and regulate heavy industries are immense.
So to sustain these country-level actions, the framework introduces two vital global enabling indicators, officially establishing lead as an investment priority and formalizing it as a global political priority. Because without robust global backing and real empathy for the challenges developing nations face, local efforts are eventually going to run out of steam.
Ambition requires capital, right? To sustain these actions, the framework outlines a goal of securing over $750 million in external grant and grant-equivalent financing by 2030, and then scaling that up to over $850 million by 2040. This is the financial oxygen needed. It pays for the lab equipment, the training, the enforcement officers, and the community outreach necessary to create the enabling environment for these life-saving policies to actually take root on the ground.
Putting it all together basically creates a highly synchronized global sprint. We move from early data gathering and priority identification in 2027 to a heavily funded midpoint acceleration in 2030 with that $750 million invested. By 2035, routine national surveillance becomes the global norm, paving the final stretch to that 95% reduction outcome in 2040. Every single milestone relies entirely on the success of the one that came before it.
Which leads us to our final section, activating global partnerships, or what we can call the village.
As we all know, a piece of paper doesn't change the world. People do. National governments are central because they hold the authority, they enact the laws, and they have the ultimate accountability to report official data. But right next to them are the implementing partners, the NGOs and civil society groups. They provide the operational muscle, validate the data, and pilot the actual interventions on the ground. See, one provides the sovereign mandate, and the other provides the crucial operational momentum to actually get it done.
And on the ground, this requires a deeply multi-sectoral reality. You need students and grassroots community members driving local awareness and neighborhood cleanups on one side, and highly trained technicians conducting rigorous laboratory testing on consumer products on the other. You simply can't solve a systemic issue like this from an office building. It requires everyday community engagement working hand-in-hand with high-level technical regulation.
Then we look at the money and the markets. The financial sector, including large development banks, provides the heavy lifting capital for infrastructure and lab capacities, constantly linking lead reduction to larger human capital outcomes. Meanwhile, the private sector is tasked with cleaning up their own house, eliminating lead in manufacturing, reformulating paints to be lead-free, securing global supply chains for safer batteries, and actively sharing their technical expertise to develop safer alternatives across the board. Finally, we have the watchdogs, the harmonizers, and the innovators. Regional bodies ensure that safety standards cross borders effectively. Academic institutions generate the raw evidence we need to identify completely new exposure threats, and civil society plays the absolutely crucial role of sustaining public attention and advocacy. They're the ones who ensure that when political winds or funding cycles inevitably shift, the momentum to protect these kids doesn't just fade away.
We started this explainer with the staggering number, 1 billion children. The cost of inaction is 1 billion futures compromised by entirely preventable exposure. The framework is built, the targets are set, and the partners are aligning. We must all ask ourselves, looking at this massive global mobilization, how do we contribute to this collective responsibility? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and I really encourage you to think about how your industry, your community, or your advocacy can help build a lead-free 2040.